They were a kaleidoscope of forms, slender insectoids with faceted eyes, lumbering quadrupeds armored in carapace, and sinuous beings whose skin glowed with bioluminescent patterns. Yet, amidst this collection of evolutionary wonders, the human delegation stood out for their simplicity. To many, they looked fragile, primitive even, clad in their tailored uniforms rather than natural armor or exoskeletons. Captain Eric Ford, tall and broad-shouldered with a calm, steady gaze, stood at the head of the human group. He exuded quiet confidence, his posture that of a man accustomed to command. Beside him were two aides, their expressions carefully neutral. As the chamber's murmur subsided, Eric observed the room, his eyes locking momentarily with those of General Akhtar, the Zarnak Empire's chief military strategist. The general leaned back in his ornate chair, his elongated, scaled fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. His four crimson eyes narrowed as he regarded the humans with thinly veiled disdain. "It is commendable," he began, his deep, guttural voice dripping with condescension, "that your species has managed to join this esteemed council. A testament, perhaps, to your stubbornness." The room rippled with faint laughter from the other delegates. Akhtar's mandibles clicked in amusement before he continued. "But let us speak plainly. War is not in your nature." Eric offered a thin smile, his hands clasped behind his back. He remained silent, his lack of response drawing the attention of Ambassador Torin Velker, a willowy, silver-skinned being whose expression was unreadable. Unlike Akhtar, Velker had been cautious in his assessment of humanity, though not entirely free of skepticism. His bioluminescent tendrils dimmed and brightened as he addressed the room. "The humans have shown a remarkable aptitude for diplomacy," Velker said, his melodic voice soothing yet firm. "Their methods may differ from ours, but adaptability is not to be underestimated. However, the question remains, can they contribute to the impending conflict? The Kaltoran swarm will not be swayed by words." Akhtar emitted a low growl, his scales bristling. "Precisely. The swarm is relentless. They are predators, bound to no treaty and driven only by the hunger of their hive mind. What can these soft creatures possibly offer in the face of such a threat?" Ford's smile widened almost imperceptibly. He glanced at his aides, who stood rigid and silent, before stepping forward. "General Akhtar," he began, his voice even and measured, "I appreciate your candidness. It's refreshing to hear such unvarnished opinions." His gaze flicked briefly to Velker. "And Ambassador Velker, your concern is noted. But humanity has long learned that strength is not always measured by size or ferocity." The general's laughter was sharp and grating. "Spare us your platitudes, Captain. Strength is measured in victories. Do you have those?" Ford didn't answer immediately. Instead, he surveyed the room, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle some of the less aggressive delegates. "Human history," he said finally, his tone soft but deliberate, "is a tapestry woven with conflict. We've fought wars of survival, wars of ideology, wars to end wars. We have learned from each, and what we've learned is this: war is not glorious. It is not an arena for pride or ego. It is a crucible, and only those who adapt leave it alive." Akhtar sneered, his sharp teeth glinting. "Grand words. But words alone will not halt the swarm. The Council has already assigned your fleet a role, scouting. It suits your capabilities." Ford inclined his head, the gesture an elegant acceptance of the perceived slight. "Scouting is indeed an important task. Understanding the enemy is the foundation of any effective strategy." His voice held no trace of resentment, only a quiet confidence that seemed to unnerve some of the gathered aliens. Akhtar leaned forward, his claws raking across the polished surface of the table. "Pray that your understanding proves useful, human. When the swarm devours your ships, we'll see how adaptable you truly are." Velker intervened before Ford could respond, his tendrils flashing brighter, as if to signal a change in tone. "Gentlemen, this is neither the time nor the place for such disputes. The Kaltoran swarm is our mutual threat. If humanity can prove its worth, I, for one, am willing to reevaluate my reservations. Ford met Velker's gaze and nodded. That's all we ask, Ambassador. The opportunity to prove ourselves. The meeting adjourned shortly after, the alien delegates departing in clusters, their murmurs a mixture of curiosity and doubt. Akhtar cast a final glare in Ford's direction before stalking out, his armored frame making an audible clatter against the polished floor. Velker lingered for a moment, his gaze lingering on Ford. "You are confident," he observed. "I hope, for your sake, that confidence is not misplaced." Ford's lips quirked into a faint smile. "We'll see." Once the chamber had emptied, Ford turned to his aides. Commander Gary Chris, a man as disciplined as he was brilliant, raised an eyebrow. "You're letting them underestimate us, sir." "Of course," Ford replied, his tone amused. "Underestimation is a gift. Let Akhtar think we're harmless. When the time comes, we'll show them exactly what humanity is capable of." The three men walked briskly through the station's gleaming corridors toward the docking bay. The human fleet awaited orders, a mix of sleek, cutting-edge vessels bristling with hidden firepower. As Ford boarded his flagship, he paused to gaze out at the distant star. His expression hardened, the faint smile replaced by grim determination. The aliens thought they knew humanity, soft, fragile, a species to be coddled or ignored. They didn't yet understand the cost of that miscalculation, but they would. The human fleet hung like a constellation of steel in the void, its ships arranged in precise formations that spoke of discipline and readiness. At their center was the Eaglet, the flagship of Earth's burgeoning interstellar navy. Within its command deck, a hive of quiet activity. Captain Eric Ford stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the holographic map projected before him. It displayed a vast sector of space ahead, dotted with faint markers representing the Kaltoran swarm. "They're spreading," Commander Gary Chris observed, his voice measured. The tactical officer stood beside Ford, his sharp eyes scanning the map. "If these data projections hold, we'll have less than 3 standard days before they breach the outer defensive perimeter." Ford nodded, his expression calm, though his mind raced. The swarm's advance was faster than anticipated. Each marker represented not just an enemy force, but an intricate part of a hive mind, a predator whose strength lay in coordination and relentless adaptation. The rest of the council had underestimated the threat. Ford wouldn't make the same mistake. Behind them, Lieutenant Carl Thomas entered the deck, his stride confident and his flight suit slightly unzipped to reveal a cocky grin. "So, when do we stop playing tag and start showing these bugs what we're made of?" he asked, leaning casually against the console. Chris shot him a sharp look. "We're not here to show anything, Thomas. This isn't a bar fight." "No," Thomas replied, shrugging. "But it'd be nice if these aliens stopped treating us like the help." Ford turned, his calm gaze silencing the banter. "We'll earn their respect, Lieutenant. Not with bravado, but with results." He gestured to the map, redirecting their focus. "We've been assigned a scouting mission, and I intend to use it to our advantage. The Council assumes this is reconnaissance, but for us, it's an opportunity to gain the upper hand." The Eaglet shifted into readiness as Ford's orders rippled through the fleet. In the hangar bays, pilots prepared their crafts, mechanics made final adjustments to engines, and AI systems ran diagnostics. Humanity's technology, though often dismissed as young by the Council, was cutting-edge in its own right. The fleet stealth systems were unrivaled, their adaptive algorithms capable of cloaking not just the ships but their energy signatures as well. Where other species relied on brute force, humans had focused on precision and innovation. Ford walked through the corridors toward the briefing room, the soft hum of the ship's systems a constant backdrop. His officers awaited him there, seated around a circular table dominated by a smaller version of the holographic map. Chris stood at attention as Ford entered, while Thomas leaned back in his chair, spinning a stylus between his fingers. "We're moving into uncharted territory," Ford began, his voice steady but commanding. Our mission is to gather intelligence on the swarm's movements and capabilities. However, I suspect we'll encounter more than just scout ships." He gestured to the map, zooming in on a cluster of Kaltoran signals. "This formation suggests a staging area. If we can confirm its location, we'll not only gain valuable intel, but also disrupt their coordination before the larger fleet arrives." Thomas leaned forward, his grin fading. "Sounds like you're expecting a fight." "I'm counting on it," Ford replied, locking eyes with him. "This is our chance to test their tactics and find weaknesses. But we'll do it on our terms." The plan was simple in its elegance. The fleet would divide into two groups. A smaller, stealth-equipped task force would infiltrate the Kaltoran staging area, while the larger fleet maintained a defensive perimeter to cover their retreat if necessary. Ford, as always, placed himself at the heart of the operation. The tension aboard the Eaglet grew as the task force prepared to deploy. Ford sat in the captain's chair, the holographic interface before him displaying the readiness status of each ship. "Commander Chris," he said, breaking the silence, "keep the perimeter tight. If the swarm detects us, we'll need an immediate extraction." "Aye, sir," Chris replied, his tone clipped but confident. Thomas, now seated in his fighter's cockpit, chimed in over the comms. "Don't worry, Captain. If things go south, I'll buy us enough time to get out." Ford allowed himself a faint smile. "Just stick to the plan, Lieutenant." The task force slipped into the void, their stealth systems rendering them invisible to all but the most sophisticated detection arrays. As they approached the suspected staging area, the scope of the swarm's presence became clear. Thousands of smaller vessels swirled around a massive central structure, its organic architecture pulsating with a sickly green light. It was not just a staging area. It was a hive nexus, a key node in the swarm's communication network. Thomas's voice crackled over the comms. "That's a lot of bugs. You sure this is just recon?" "Quiet, Thomas," Chris cut in, his voice sharp. Ford's eyes narrowed as he studied the hive. "This changes things. If we can disrupt that nexus, we'll throw their entire advance into chaos." Chris hesitated. "Sir, the Council didn't authorize." "The Council isn't here," Ford interrupted, his tone firm but measured. "We are, and we have an opportunity to act." The plan shifted rapidly, the team's adaptability coming to the forefront. Thomas and a squadron of fighters would create a diversion, drawing the swarm's attention, while a strike team infiltrated the hive to plant an EMP device. It was a high-risk maneuver, but the rewards were too great to ignore. As the operation commenced, the void exploded into chaos. Thomas's squadron darted through the swarm's ranks, their ships dancing like fireflies as they unleashed precision strikes. The swarm reacted as expected, swarming toward the distraction with single-minded ferocity. Meanwhile, the strike team approached the hive under cover of the diversion. Ford monitored their progress from the Eaglet, his jaw clenched as he tracked their every move. The tension on the bridge was palpable, each officer focused on their role. The strike team succeeded in breaching the hive's defenses, planting the EMP device deep within its structure. As they retreated, the swarm began to react, their movements becoming more erratic. Ford's voice cut through the comms. "Thomas, pull back. The clock's ticking." "Already on it, Captain," Thomas replied, his voice laced with adrenaline. The detonation of the EMP was a blinding burst of energy, silencing the hive's pulsating light and leaving the swarm's vessels adrift. The strike team and Thomas's squadron returned to the task force as the larger fleet prepared for their extraction. As the Eaglet and its companions slipped back into the void, Ford allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The mission had been a success, but he knew this was only the beginning. The Kaltoran swarm had been dealt a blow, but they would adapt, just as humanity had. Ford turned to Chris, his expression unreadable. "Prepare the report for the Council. They'll want to know what we found." Chris nodded, but his brow furrowed. "Do you think they'll listen this time?" Ford's lips twitched into a faint smile. "They don't have a choice. We've made our presence known. The vastness of space had never felt so small. The combined fleets of the Galactic Council formed an imposing wall of firepower, their ships glowing against the void with the vibrant hues of alien technology. At their center, the flagship of the Zarnak Empire, Imperator, loomed like a metallic predator, its spiked hull bristling with weaponry. Beside it were the fleets of other Council species, each with its own distinct aesthetic, organic, crystalline, or gleaming alloys shaped into forms both elegant and functional. Yet amidst this assembly of alien grandeur, the human fleet remained an understated presence, a cluster of efficient, unassuming vessels. On the bridge of the Eaglet, Captain Eric Ford stood at the helm, his gaze locked on the battle map. The Kaltoran swarm had arrived. Thousands of their vessels, sleek and organic, poured into the sector like a living tide, their movements too chaotic for any conventional fleet to counter. Each ship pulsed with an eerie green luminescence, a hive mind's heartbeat driving them forward. "Contact in 2 minutes," Commander Gary Chris reported, his voice crisp. His hands moved deftly across his console, ensuring the fleet maintained its defensive formation. Eric nodded, his expression calm. "All ships, hold position. We wait for their first wave." The Council strategy had been set by General Akhtar, who now sat aboard the Imperator. His plan was simple: brute force. The coalition fleets would form an impenetrable line, using their superior firepower to hold the swarm at bay. It was a strategy born of arrogance, one that failed to account for the swarm's ability to adapt. "Akhtar's already engaging," Chris muttered, pointing to the map as the Zarnak fleet surged forward, their ships firing devastating plasma beams into the advancing swarm. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. Hundreds of Kaltoran ships were obliterated in brilliant flashes of light. But as the seconds passed, the swarm shifted, their movements synchronizing into a new pattern. They began to encircle the Zarnak forces, exploiting gaps in their formation. Ford watched in silence, his jaw tightening. "They're baiting us into overextending," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Lieutenant Carl Thomas's voice came through the comms, laced with tension. "Captain, they're cutting through Akhtar's line. If we don't do something, the whole flank's going to collapse." Eric's hand hovered over the tactical interface, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to act, to step in and take control, but the Council had placed Akhtar in command. The alien general's voice crackled over the open comms, barking orders to his fleet. "Do not retreat. Press the attack. They cannot withstand our firepower." "They don't have to," Eric muttered. The swarm was forcing the coalition to waste its strength. The first wave of Kaltoran ships broke through, their smaller vessels darting past the Zarnak fleet and toward the human formation. Eric turned to Chris. "Commander, prepare to intercept. Precision strikes only, conserve ammunition." "Aye, sir." The human fleet responded with surgical efficiency. Railguns and plasma cannons fired in synchronized bursts, cutting down the incoming swarm ships with minimal effort. Where the Zarnak fleet relied on overwhelming firepower, the humans focused on precision, targeting key ships that disrupted the swarm's cohesion. Thomas led his squadron into the fray, his fighter weaving through the chaos with practiced ease. "Got 3 on my tail," he called out, his voice steady despite the tension. "Keep them close," Eric replied. "Chris, deploy drone swarms to Thomas's position." Within moments, a cluster of autonomous drones launched from the Eaglet, their sleek forms swarming around Thomas's fighter. The Kaltoran ships pursuing him faltered, their movements disrupted by the drone's interference. Thomas took the opportunity to loop back and unleash a volley of missiles, destroying his attackers in a brilliant cascade of explosions. "Nice save," Thomas said, his grin audible over the comms. "Stay focused," Eric replied. "This isn't over." The battle raged on, the swarm's relentless waves pressing against the coalition fleets. The Zarnak forces were taking heavy losses, their ships unable to adapt to the swarm's shifting tactics. General Akhtar's voice grew more frantic over the comms, his orders increasingly desperate. Eric's gaze returned to the map, where a pattern was beginning to emerge. The swarm wasn't just attacking. They were herding the coalition forces, forcing them into a tighter formation. At the center of the chaos, a massive Kaltoran vessel emerged, a hive ship, its organic structure pulsating with energy. "That's their command ship," Chris said, his voice low. Eric nodded. "And the key to this battle. If we can take it out, the rest of the swarm will fall into disarray." "The Council won't authorize that kind of risk," Chris said, his tone cautious. "They don't have to," Eric replied, his voice firm. He tapped into the fleet-wide comms. "This is Captain Eric Ford of the Eaglet. I'm assuming tactical command of this operation. All human ships, form up on me." There was a moment of silence, followed by a chorus of acknowledgments from the human fleet. Eric turned to Chris. "Send word to the Council. Tell them we're engaging the hive ship." Chris hesitated, then nodded. "Aye, sir." The human fleet broke from the coalition line, their ships moving with precision toward the hive ship. Thomas's squadron provided cover, engaging the swarm ships that moved to intercept. The Eaglet led the charge, its weapons firing in controlled bursts as it closed the distance. As they approached the hive ship, its organic surface began to shift, revealing rows of bioluminescent cannons. The ship fired, its energy blasts cutting through space with terrifying speed. Eric's hands moved across the controls, issuing rapid commands. "Evasive maneuvers. Target those cannons." The Eaglet dodged the incoming fire, its own weapon striking back with pinpoint accuracy. The hive ship's defenses began to falter, its once-coordinated attacks growing erratic. "Captain, we're picking up energy surges from the hive ship," Chris reported. "It's preparing a massive attack." Eric's mind raced. If the hive ship's attack connected, it could devastate their entire fleet. But if they could disable it first— "Thomas," Eric called over the comms. "Take your squadron and target the hive ship's energy core. We'll cover you." "Understood, Captain," Thomas replied. The fighter squadron darted toward the hive ship, weaving through a storm of enemy fire. The Eaglet and its accompanying ships unleashed a barrage of covering fire, drawing the swarm's attention. Thomas's voice came through the comms. "I see the core, moving in." The hive ship's energy surged, its pulsating light growing brighter. Eric's grip tightened on the console. "Thomas, now or never." "Got it," Thomas shouted. His fighter unleashed a payload of missiles, each one striking the hive ship's energy core with devastating precision. The core erupted in a blinding explosion, sending shockwaves rippling through space. The hive ship structure began to collapse, its bioluminescent glow fading. The swarm's movements faltered, their once-coordinated attacks devolving into chaos. Eric leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "All ships, fall back to defensive positions. The swarm isn't finished yet, but we've given them something to think about." As the human fleet regrouped, Eric allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. For the first time, the galaxy had seen what humanity was capable of, and it was only the beginning. The aftermath of the battle unfolded in a silence that felt heavier than the clash of war itself. The stars, distant and indifferent, bore witness to the wreckage that now drifted aimlessly in the void. The coalition fleet had survived, though barely. Broken ships limped into formation, their hulls scarred and their energy reserves depleted. In the command deck of the Eaglet, Captain Eric Ford stood at the center of controlled chaos. Crew members worked frantically to repair systems and assess damages, their faces lit by the soft glow of their consoles. Ford's own face was stoic, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed the weight he carried. "Damage report," he said, his voice steady despite the weariness that pulled at him. Commander Gary Chris stepped forward, holding a datapad. "We've lost 3 ships from our fleet, sir. The Vanguard, Eclipse, and Cerberus. Casualties estimated at over 200. Other vessels sustained moderate to heavy damage." Ford nodded, the numbers settling into his mind like stones in a pond. "And the coalition, Chris hesitated. The Zarnak fleet is decimated. Over half their ships are gone. The Kalashi and Navori forces suffered similar losses. General Akhtar is demanding an immediate debrief with all commanding officers. Ford allowed himself a faint, humorless smile. Of course he is. As Chris returned to his post, Lieutenant Carl Thomas's voice crackled over the comms. "Hey, Captain, you might want to see this. I'm out in recon, and I've got eyes on what's left of the Hive ship." Ford turned to the communications officer. "Patch it through." The main screen flickered to life, displaying the jagged remains of the Kaltoran Hive ship. It hung in the void like a wounded predator, its organic hull broken but still faintly glowing. Smaller Kaltoran ships circled it in disarray, their movements erratic without the guidance of the Hive mind. "They're retreating," Thomas said, his tone tinged with disbelief. "The swarm's actually pulling back." Ford's eyes narrowed. "Not retreating. Regrouping." The silence on the bridge was palpable as the crew absorbed the implications. The swarm was not defeated, merely set back. Their Hive ship had been destroyed, but they were already adapting, as they always did. "What's our next move?" Chris asked, his voice quiet but eager. Ford straightened, his gaze sweeping across the bridge. His crew looked to him for guidance, their trust unspoken but unwavering. He had led them through the worst of the battle, but the war was far from over. "We prepare," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "This victory bought us time, but it's not enough. The swarm will come back stronger, and we need to be ready." Later, in the council chambers aboard the Imperator, the surviving leaders of the coalition convened. The room was a stark contrast to the chaos outside, its pristine walls and elegant architecture a reminder of the galactic power's hubris. General Akhtar stood at the head of the table, his imposing frame radiating authority despite the clear strain on his features. "This disaster falls squarely on your shoulders," Akhtar began, his gaze fixed on Ford. "Your unauthorized actions endangered the entire fleet and jeopardized our position." Ford met the alien general's glare with unflinching calm. "My actions saved what was left of the fleet. If we had continued with your plan, there wouldn't be a coalition left to argue over." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The other commanders, battered and weary, exchanged uncertain glances. Even the typically aloof Navori emissary, adorned in his crystalline armor, seemed to consider Ford's words. "The swarm is unlike anything we've faced before," Ford continued, his voice steady but forceful. "They adapt. They learn. The strategies that work for your species in the past won't work here. Humanity knows what it means to fight against impossible odds. We've been doing it for centuries. And what would you suggest?" Akhtar demanded, his voice dripping with skepticism. Ford stepped forward, his presence commanding despite the simplicity of his Earth-born uniform. "We stop fighting as fragmented fleets and start acting as one. Humanity has developed technologies and tactics that can counter the swarm's adaptability, but they mean nothing if we don't share our resources and knowledge. This isn't about pride or hierarchy. It's about survival." For a moment, the room was silent. Then the Navori emissary spoke, his voice resonating like chimes. "The human speaks truth. The swarm has shown us the cost of our arrogance. If we are to prevail, we must learn from their unity." The tension in the room began to ease, though Akhtar's expression remained stormy. "Very well," the general said grudgingly. "But know this, failure is not an option. If your methods prove insufficient, the consequences will fall on your people." Ford inclined his head, his expression neutral. "Understood." Back aboard the Eaglet, Ford gathered his senior officers in the briefing room. The holographic map displayed the remnants of the battle, along with projections of the swarm's likely movements. "This is our chance to redefine how we fight," Ford said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "The Council may not trust us yet, but they'll have no choice once they see what we can do. Chris, I want a full report on the fleet's readiness within the hour. Thomas, start coordinating with the other species fighter squadrons. We're going to teach them how to fight like humans. The officers nodded, their resolve evident. Humanity had been underestimated, dismissed as newcomers in a galaxy of ancient powers. But in the face of the swarm, their ingenuity and resilience had proven to be their greatest strengths. As the officers dispersed, Ford lingered in the briefing room, his gaze fixed on the map. The swarm was out there, regrouping and evolving. The war was far from over, but for the first time, the galaxy was beginning to understand what humanity was capable of. And so was Ford. The weight of leadership was heavy, but it was one he bore willingly. This war was not just about survival. It was about defining humanity's place among the stars. They had shown their strength, their adaptability, and their unity. Now, it was time to show the galaxy something even more profound: their humanity. For Eric Ford, for his crew, and for Earth, the fight had only just begun.